Oh, hello, and welcome to episode 28 of the barn door restoration. Last episode, I fitted the control tubes. This episode, I got the cover for the underseat storage finished off. So this is basically just a storage box. It has a floor in it, and the bench seat sits on top of this. So you just lift the bench seat up and throw things in here. And it on the front of it has a spot for the heater control knob. And that's just basically a tube that's threaded on the end. And the other end is crushed down to fit the two 8mm control tubes. Then it also has a hole for the choke cable. And there's a couple holes down here with T-nuts welded in them. And that's for a piece of front floor that's removable bolts there. And there's a couple holes here for rubber bumpers. And that's for the legs for the bench seat, set on those. And there's an extra hole down here, and it had a rubber plug in it. In fact, when I was cleaning it off, I thought it was just something stuck to it, and it turned out it was just dried rubber from the old plug, and it was a painted hole. Some people thought it might be used for drainage when they dipped these. Now, they weren't dipped in a paint, but they might have been dipped in something to etch the metal or some other thing. But anyway, there's an odd little hole there. There were some changes in these. The early ones didn't have this little dip here. They just kind of rounded over. So I'm not sure when that change happened. There's also some have another hole here or here somewhere in there with a rubber bumper. So there's changes through the years. Now this is 0.9mm steel, so 20 gauge. But there's a lot of variance in it. So when they stamped it, there's some spots that are very thin. In fact, right along here, it's very thin metal. Also, this lip in the corners is quite thin. In fact, this corner here was ripped and is opened up. I left that there because it's a factory defect, so I left that in. There's also folds in the metal on these corners. So when it was stamped, the metal actually folded on itself. So this is just spot welds to the inner frame panel where it extends up. And also spot welds to the floor right across here. And then it'll spot weld to the bulkhead when it goes on. So this one was quite rusty. Here's the corner that was in here. You see it was in quite bad shape. And it was rotted up into the sides. This side here was rotted out, holes. This back lip was rotted off. This front section here was pretty rotten. So I had quite a bit of work to do. So one of the big issues repairing this is this contoured shape around this opening. So there's a bunch of little bends here. They're all different radiuses. They kind of flow into each other. They're very tight together. Not something you can do on a break. So I decided to try the bead roller. So what I did is I 3D printed some dies. They just kind of roll on there to get the shape. And these were actually test dies. They're printed much thinner and weaker than I would have normally done. But my idea was I was going to print them quickly, test it on a piece of metal, make sure I was getting the right shape, things were going to work. And so I don't have much experience doing this, so I wanted to check it out. But they worked good enough, so I ended up making these with these test dies. They did deform very slightly, but not enough to bother anything. One thing about these is the radiuses and shapes were different everywhere. In fact, from one end to the other, they don't measure the same. Don't really notice it when you're looking at it, but when you go to measure it, they're all different. So to make those, I actually put the first bend in on my piece of metal, and so that would run against my die, and make it less work for the bead roller. So once they were rolled in, I had those two pieces. The back piece is easy. I just had to trim it and put a lip on it. But the side has this channel, and this channel is 3 different radiuses. And the same with the piece over here, I had to place the same thing. So to do that on the brake, by putting another piece of metal that's been already bent above the piece you're bending, we'll give it a larger radius. So this lower one, I actually put a piece of 14 gauge in the brake, and that gave me the right radius on that. And this upper bend, I put a piece of 20 gauge in the brake, and that gave me the correct radius for those. The trick was trying to get them exactly the right distance apart to match this shape. It took a while I did a few test pieces first to make sure I was getting it right. The problem with the brake when you put stuff in it to give bigger radiuses is figuring out where to mark your bend to get the center of it, because it actually moves your bend out further. This corner has a weird little shape to it, and the way I got that is I just trimmed my pieces off in such a way that they fit together to give me this shape. And then I welded in the flat surfaces, and then I dollied the corners and rounded them off, make them nice and rounded, and then welded them after, smoothed them. This corner here, I actually cut a separate piece here and shaped that. And these ends, I tried to keep as much of the original metal as I could. And so I kind of cut my the rusty metal out to keep as much of the good metal as I could. So I started using the TIG on this. I haven't used the TIG on steel up to now because it was easier for me to just grab the MIG welder. But I need to learn how to use the TIG, especially when it gets the outer body metal. So anyway, I started using it. It works really well. It does a great job, but I'm not very good at it, so it takes me forever. So you get a little frustrated how long it was taking, and I just grab the MIG and finish it off. But I will continue to work at it, and I'm learning what I'm doing wrong and how to fix it. And it just takes a lot of practice. So it took quite a while to weld it up because of these weird shapes. And usually what I do is I weld in the horizontal areas, and then the angle parts and the corners, I dolly those in, get them perfect, and then weld those in. Across the front here was a bit of an issue because the metal was so thin. You had to be very careful. And around these corners, there were spots where it was so thin that you had to be very, very careful welding, because they had to weld they were rusted quite close to them. And I didn't want to warp it all to pieces either. So that, and there's a little difference in thickness between the 20 gauge and this where it's stamped. It thinned it so much, there's a difference. But that lines up right with the inner floor panel. So it won't show from the inside once everything's welded. And there is a seam sealer that goes on the inside of this area. So once I had this all welded up and sanded and shaped, smoothed out, I fitted it in here and spot welded it. Now, the way this channel's made, the electrodes on my spot welder wouldn't fit in here. And it's quite common for a lot of areas that you go to spot weld. So what I did is I took some copper blocks and I just made these extensions. And I just took the tip that unscrews out of the electrode, moved it out, tapped the block, and screwed it in. So that allowed me to get in these areas. Now I didn't spot weld the floor where it joins here, because I have to do that from underneath, and this thing's a lot heavier than it looks, and it's awkward, and trying to hold that up in there in the right spot and spot weld is going to be a pain. So I'm going to do that on the rotisserie, much easier. Plus it's going to be easier with longer electrodes. Now I do have some material to make longer ones. So basically just copper rod, and that'll go in. And instead of using the tips, I will use a smaller rod as my consumable. And that'll be drilled and clamped on the end. And I'll be able to shape this however I want, because this is relatively inexpensive. You can buy the electrodes in lots of shapes, but they're quite pricey, and this will give me a lot more flexibility. So once I had this welded in place, there's two control tubes for the heater that need to weld into the back of this tube. So they slide up in 10 millimeters inside of this tube, and then you just have a big gob of weld that welds them in. Something you have to be careful not to get too much heat, because you don't want to distort the tube too much. So this part probably took me 20 hours to restore. I am very happy with how it came out, though. I was worried originally that I was going to be able to get this shape just right, and it was going to look like an original part, but I'm happy how it came out. I upload drawings of this to GrabCAD. There's a link in the description. There's also a link in the description for the playlist for this. My next episode is the fenders. The two fenders, and they're very rusty, and I'm probably going to have to actually try stamping some shapes in those. So it'll be fun experimenting with that. So that's my next episode. Keep watching for a video of the work on this and some detailed shots of the part. Thanks for the comments, and thanks for watching.